Hello there, and thanks for tuning in to this first episode of what is Season 3 of Raising the Roof. I'm Nick Atkin, and you're listening to the podcast that brings business leaders and industry experts together to unpick the hot topics in housing and also beyond. Today, I'm absolutely delighted, in fact, in Yorkshire terms, I'm well chuffed, to be joined by Britain's most prominent housing campaigner, Kwajo Tweneboa. So, Kwajo, welcome.
Thank you.
For many of you listening to this podcast, Kwajo will need no introduction. He's arguably been one of the single biggest drivers for change across the housing sector. And for many people, he's provided them with a voice as part of his campaigning on behalf of literally thousands of social housing tenants. Like many who work in the sector, I've followed your story, Kwajo, with considerable interest and huge admiration. And I think the reason for that is you have this amazing ability to tell the story from the customer's perspective and really shine a light on where things aren't working. And that's led you to being described by people much more knowledgeable than me as Britain's brightest social housing champion. So thanks so much for joining me today, Kwajo, and welcome to Yorkshire.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be on the podcast too.
Now, I know, and apologies in advance, because I know you've shared your story many, many times, but perhaps for anybody who's just landed from Mars or who isn't fully aware of your background, perhaps you could just spend a few minutes for me sharing the events that led up to you posting those photos of your home on social media. What was sort of three and a bit years ago?
Yes, yeah, nearly 3 years. I think it'll be 3 years in March.
Wow.
Actually, yeah, so 2 months out. Yeah, so for the majority of my life, I'm 25 now. I have lived
you
in
don't
social...
look it, I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
I need your skincare techniques.
A few more years of campaigning, I'm sure I will. No, I've lived in social housing for the majority of my life, and for a lot of it was poor quality social housing. So me and my siblings and dad pretty much started off in temporary accommodation in South London, and it happened to be a converted car garage. I mean, it still had the garage door on. It had issues with damp and mould. We had an infestation of ants, and this is whilst I was studying for my A-levels. My younger sister was studying for her GCSEs, and it was very difficult. It was really, really hard. I remember the time, actually, because it was actually, in fact, the same time Grenfell happened. I remember waking up one morning and seeing it on the news, aerial shots of the fire the morning after. And that's something that stuck with me. That will always remind me of the fact we were in the temporary accommodation at that time. And in 2018, we were moved into my now home, permanent social housing. And it was in complete disrepair being moved in. When we were moved in, we had issues of cockroaches, mice, damp, mould. We had kitchen that was nearly 100 years old. And we had
100 years old?
Yeah. Wow. We had poor security to the house, and we had a bathroom which wasn't fit for use. We had lights that were filled with water. The list is endless. I'm sure I missed out loads of problems with the house back then, and we had been complaining. It had fallen on deaf ears and just simply wasn't dealt with. My dad became ill. He was diagnosed with stage 1 esophageal cancer about a year after moving in, and then a year later that had progressed from stage 1 to stage 4. So he went from walking around, being independent, to being bedbound in a hospital bed in our living room, and being fed through his stomach 3 times a day by district nurses in those conditions. And they were horrified. They were quite frankly disgusted that he was in those conditions, but ultimately, he was our priority. We wanted him to get better. Unfortunately, he didn't, and in January 2020, he passed away after an infection in his stomach. No doubt, I believe, was caused because of the conditions that we were in, and he passed away. And things went from bad to worse. On the day of his funeral, 28th of February 2020, we had a massive leak, and the ceiling above where his hospital bed was caved in. That wasn't dealt with or looked at until October the same year. No one came out, and bearing in mind that had happened in February. And then the ceiling was pulled down, and it wasn't put back up until after Christmas. It was January the following year. So we were left in we had a living room that was basically a building site. There was beams, and we weren't told that it contained Artex too, and there was dust left everywhere, as well as all of the other sort of disrepair. And it got to a point where I had enough. There was one day I was at work. I was working in a school at the time, and I was spending more time in school instead of doing my job on the phone to my housing provider in the call centre. And the person on the other side of the phone that day was rude, extremely rude, and was dismissive. They said they're not coming out, they're really busy, hung the phone up on me. And I said at that point, I won't be contacting them again. It will be a journalist. And I didn't know any journalists at that time, but I was very determined to make sure that that was the case. So I went into my house, took pictures, took videos, uploaded to social media, and within a matter of hours, it had gone viral. I had local news come down, and then my provider turned around and said along the lines of, we're sorry that Kwajo feels as though him and his family didn't receive the service that they deserved after knowing that my dad passed away in those conditions and everything else that came with it. And that for me was the sort of flame that lit the match sort of thing that is still burning even today. And I remember thinking, if that's the game they want to play, fair enough. So I went around my whole estate, knocked on every single door, over 500 properties, put letters in the doors with the local residents associations. And before I had done a lap of the estate, I had people emailing me, sending me messages, texts, videos, pictures of the horrific conditions that they were staying in. One lady, 27 years, she had disrepair and had been complaining and didn't receive the help. There was a lady in her 60s that was having to buy cement and mix it herself in her kitchen to fill, and she was in her 60s, to fill the holes that mice were coming in through in her kitchen, in her bathroom. It was just falling to bits. And ITV News came down, filmed 2-week undercover investigation that went out as a top story nationally and disgraced our landlord into carrying out necessary works. And since then, I haven't really looked back. I've had residents contact me up and down the country, across London first and foremost, then across the country, requesting similar help, advice. And yeah, that's been the last 3 years of what I've been doing, yeah.
It's incredibly brave to post photographs of what is your home that's clearly not in anywhere near an acceptable condition. I'm just interested at that point. Was it a combination of anger or frustration? Was it something else? What was going on inside your head and your heart at that time? That where you just thought, you know what, I need the world to see this.
Yeah, it was 3 things actually. It was very embarrassing at the time. I remember thinking like this could go one of 2 ways. There was also an element of knowing that my provider simply isn't going to listen. I came to the conclusion after that conversation where I just thought they absolutely just don't care. Then they're not going to listen. I've tried and I've tried and I've tried again to get them to, and they won't. So I said, it's enough. This is my only option. This is of all the options, the long list I had, this was the last option that I had left.
Right.
And I decided to take it. But also I think it was, on top of that, everything that had happened with my dad becoming ill, passing away, and the sort of depression that came with that, and thinking to myself that all the anger that came with that too, remembering and constantly thinking he was in those conditions, he was having to live in the hospital bed in those conditions. I remember the increase in anger I felt towards that, and I thought, no, like they cannot go around continuing to do this to rent-paying tenants, ultimately, that are helping contribute towards the wages of members of staff that work for that organisation, that get to go home at the end of the day to their nice homes, their nice families, whilst we all live in what was described by one of the contractors that came into my house as not even fit for animals to live in.
Wow, right.
And I just, that for me was enough.
Yeah, I can definitely see what triggers that, and I suppose it was I follow you on social media, and I think your pictures and your videos are so incredibly powerful in terms of explaining why something needs to be done. So, but I appreciate it's difficult, and it must be difficult for those people who share those photographs with you to actually say, well, this is my home, and as you say, worry that it could go one of 2 ways. And I suppose I'm just keen to also just understand a little bit about the support that you had, because I know a few people have supported you on the way. I know you mentioned about the school that you worked at, and I know your head teacher previously said that Kwajo had changed the world. Does it feel like you have? Does it feel like that impact that you've had when you look back from that first post that you made to where things are now? Does it feel like you've changed the world?
It's weird from my perspective, and I had this conversation with someone recently that I just keep going and take every day as it comes, and there's not really time to reflect because it's an ongoing thing that still hasn't got to the end point. So I feel like I don't have that opportunity to stand back and reflect because I know what the goal is and where I want it to go, and I won't be satisfied and be able to look back with satisfaction until I reach that point. Having said that, the last 3 years has been absolutely mental, and on the odd occasion I do look back, I think I wanted this to happen. I didn't think it would happen as quickly. And often I'm told by people like it's insane. It's absolutely insane what has happened. And I think for me, what highlights it the most is the residents that I work with and their situations happen to change. So from them living with vermin or living in disrepair and their kids struggling with their help, to them being moved out or living in a home which is finally a place that they can call home and not having to stress the kids on having to worry about their housing instead of their education and those sorts of things. That's the biggest, I think, sense of realisation that I get from, and satisfaction that I get from doing this work. But yeah, it's weird. I don't think I've fully reflected on everything up until this point.
Well, you have had a huge impact, a massive impact. I think probably more impact than anybody I've seen in probably the last 20 years in housing. And I think that's a good thing. I think you've shone a light on a whole range of issues. I'm also interested just in terms of, you mentioned your dad, and both of us have suffered losses of parents. And I'm just interested, because your dad was a carer, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
So I'm just interested, if your dad was sat in the studio now with us, what do you think he'd be saying about what Kwajo has achieved?
He would probably laugh, I think. He would just think it's absolutely mad. I mean, he used to love, for example, watching BBC News. Like, when we were growing up, he would just have it on, even if he was sleeping. There would be no, well, when we were really young, kids shows for a bit, but it would always end back on BBC News. He would fall asleep to it. So the fact that he never saw me on that show, but the fact that now he would just absolutely laugh. Like, he'd just, I think, piss himself laughing, to be honest, at the fact that those sorts of things are happening now. But I know he'd be proud, because he was from a caring background. He was a carer. He cared about people, and that's why he did it. From when he came over from Ghana, that's why he chose that vocation, because he wanted to help people. And he would get satisfaction out of, I think, me doing that work above anything else. It's that ability to help people. So I think it's weird. You do think these things, and I think after Dad passed away, I thought a lot about it. Would he, if given the opportunity to be here today, or things panned out how they did and he passed away from cancer, but knowing that so many other people were helped as a result of him passing away in the way that he did, would he change that? And I genuinely believe he wouldn't. I genuinely believe that. So yeah, he'd be proud, I think. He would,
He'd have every right to be. So he'd have every right to be. The approach that you take with other residents, and, you know, as I said before, I've seen how effective you've been at sharing the stories of other residents. It's not just the photographs and the videos, but it's the impact. It's how it makes those people feel. And I'm just interested, first of all, just how many homes would you say that you've visited over the past couple of years? A guesstimate, a best guesstimate.
It's in its thousands.
Thousands,
yeah, it's in its thousands. Right. Yeah, it's definitely in its. I've been to multiple estates, been into multiple homes, spoken to loads of residents, whether it just be on the phone and whatnot, but actually visiting homes, it's thousands.
Right. So from all those thousands of conversations you've had with families up and down the country, and I know you're all over the country, what 3 things would you say, if you were to summarise and distill all that down, what are the 3 things that tenants and residents across the country are saying at the moment that they need from their landlord that they're currently not getting?
1, and I sort of fit this under umbrella, I think culture, attitude and respect. 2, I would say dealing with their concerns in regards to disrepair and those sorts of issues in relation to how, not even just disrepair, to be honest, antisocial behaviour, all of these sort of housing factors. And 3, I would say, which kind of fits under 1, is stigma. I would say those are the 3 things that I've picked up a lot across my journey within housing. And within stigma, I'd say also consideration for mental health, I'd say, and health and mental health, I'd say.
Which, actually, that's really helpful. Can I just unpack the mental health element a little bit more? Because it's something we've had on this podcast before, in terms of, we're big advocates of really sort of shining a light on people's mental well-being. And you see so many things that aren't right, and you hear so many personal stories which, you're human, they must have an impact on you. I'm just really keen to understand, you know, how do you cope with that? You come across very calm, very relaxed, very resilient. You've got massively broad shoulders, because you're able to cope with all this. But how do you cope with that? How do you manage all of that? Because it's tough.
It is hard. And again, often get this question about mental health. But I'd always say, like, everyone's like, don't burn out. Like, worry about your mental health. Make sure you're taking time out. I remember, though, I always say I remember how bad my mental health was after my dad had passed away and the disrepair and sort of things that had happened then. And it was, I mean, absolutely in the gutter at its lowest. And
Did you have any support at that time?
I struggled a lot. I did end up going to my GP and was told I had severe depression and anxiety and given medication for that. But it was literally I had to go to my GP sort of thing because it was so bad. And I didn't at the time want to speak to anyone about it either. It was just one of those conversations that I just didn't want to have. And then I ended up actually just going and saying it very plainly to my GP. And then they said, no, you are struggling. And I think it was being robbed of a grieving period for my dad too by my housing provider. And I don't even think up until this point I've had that opportunity to grieve. And it's going to be his anniversary on the 21st, and that's going to be 4 years. But with that being said, I remember how difficult things were then. And I don't think anything could make my mental health in regards to what I'm seeing on a daily basis as bad as it was then. And the satisfaction I get from the work that I do in regards to going into people's homes and being able to change those situations that I wasn't necessarily able to do with my own dad is what I think helps with my mental health. And being able to go out and do that often is what's massively helped. But it's not easy, and there's days that is really hard. There's days that I've questioned whether I can continue. There's days that I've thought, am I gonna burn out? Am I feeling on the edge of burning out? But then I wake up the next day and continue, basically.
You go again.
Yeah, exactly. There's a quote, I'm sure it was in Finding Nemo, but there's a picture that I saw, and I think it was Dory. It was either Nemo or Dory, and it just said, just keep swimming. And that's it. And that's sort of my motto is just continue. Just continue until you get to the end. As long as you don't stop. You can go slow, you can go quickly, you get to the end. And I think that's what drives me. You're going to have a bad day, you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad weeks, but just keep going.
So if we take the swimming analogy, so how do you tread water rather than swimming full belt? In other words, how do you switch off?
How do I switch off? That's a good question. It's hard. I don't have a way of switching off. I don't think. There's been times where I went to Ghana to visit my grandma for the first time, my dad's mum, first time ever last year. And I remember being in the mall in Accra in Ghana and receiving calls from tenants over here and taking them because otherwise it would just bug me in the back of my head. And even periods like Christmas and New Year's, I was even telling myself, I'm going to have to work and send emails on Christmas Day because I was just thinking, and I've got so much to do, I could use this opportunity. I didn't in the end because I was cooking and there was no way else I could send the emails. But it's hard. And I think after this election, or the election's coming up, I've told myself I need a holiday. I need just a bit of a break, just to do something normal. Because what I have also realised is I'm 25 now. I started this when I was 22, I want to say. And this is a time of my life that I sometimes look at other young people my age and think, you guys are doing what 25-year-olds should be doing. You're going out enjoying yourself and travelling and doing all the normal things that you should be able to do. And in a way, I think to myself sometimes, am I just letting my time and my 20s pass without actually doing anything for myself within that? And it makes me realise, like, sometimes I do need to take breaks. And I'm very lucky to be doing what I'm doing right now, and I wouldn't change it for anything. I realise how important the work is that I'm doing, but I think, need to, even if it's a week or two, just have some time to just switch off. I need to learn. I think I need to relearn how to switch off.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a powerful message, and it's something that came out of the last 2 seasons of the podcast as well, when we were talking about the importance of having that time away. And if you do need a really good holiday destination, Yorkshire's got some fantastic breaks.
I bet.
I bet. Definitely recommend some outside today for you.
Yeah, no, I'm going to have a look, actually. It would be nice, and I'm sure it's absolutely peaceful compared to South London.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can recommend rural. I can recommend seaside. We've got Scarbados. We've got everything. City breaks, everything you could possibly want. So back to the things that you see day in, day out, and those thousands of people and those thousands of homes that you've been into. I'm always, my colleagues here at Yorkshire Housing always sort of say, I'm always interested in what's the root cause. How have we got here? What's led to this? So, I mean, I'm really interested in your views on how we've got here. How have we got here to where you are dealing literally with thousands of people who, for whatever reason, their homes are not at the standard that they should be? Is it a lack of funding? Is it a cultural issue? Is it Is it policy or is it something completely different? I'm just really interested because you're in quite a unique position to have a perspective, I think, which very few other people have.
I think at the very top of the sort of ladder or hierarchy of issues that have put us in the position that we find housing in now here in the UK, it stops at the door of government ultimately. Housing in this country hasn't been seen as a priority, I don't think, since after the Second World War, which is an absolute shame. And I think even just saying that shows the neglect, considering that was many, many decades ago, the neglect housing has faced in this country for many decades. The fact that for, say, the 50s, let's say, or 60s even, housing in this country, and social housing in particular, hasn't been seen as a priority is, I think, shameful. And can we really be shocked at the fact we find ourselves in this position now when it's been neglected for so long? I often question myself on that. And on top of that, we had, again, from government, the introduction of the right to buy scheme for social housing and council housing. And that completely, they should have been able to predict we would end up in a situation like this from doing that, especially in the years after where they weren't following through with replacing the homes that they promised that they would, but they're selling off. I mean, up until now, it's over 2 million council properties. Can we really be shocked that we've ended up in this situation after all of that? But then it comes also down to stigma and attitudes towards social housing tenants. I know during the coalition government, back in 2010, they didn't even like the term social housing. And that showed the sort of contempt politicians have had towards social housing in this country. We moved away from viewing housing as a necessity and a human right, and more so towards it being a luxury, an opportunity to have an asset and accumulate financial wealth. And that, for me, is the root cause of where we find ourselves now, because we move towards, again, chasing this idea of everyone needs to own their own home in order to be successful. You cannot be successful. It's almost like the American dream and the white picket fences and you own your own home. We had that same capitalistic view over here of you need to own your own home to be successful, regardless of where you are from within society. And unless you do that, you are not a success. And there was this promise of, especially with the introduction of the right to buy scheme, that you have security, affordability. And we've learned in the last year and a bit that's not the case, especially if you have mortgages. Especially when mortgages are affected, you don't have all of that all of a sudden. What people want is a roof over their head, and they want a roof over their head that's not going to cave in. They want a roof over their head that's not filled with damp and mold. They want a roof over their head or a home that's not going to be flooded with sewage or have cockroaches and mice. I mean, what I'm describing is absolutely Dickensian. You expect this in the Victorian days, and they absolutely did have this in the Victorian days. We are in 2024, and we are in the 6th richest economy in the world, yet we have thousands, I think it's even millions of people who have lived with damp and mould in their homes, but it's definitely hundreds of thousands living with current disrepair in 2024, and it's simply not good enough. But then again, it goes down to, I believe, it filters down from government level down to the housing providers and the way in which the sector has become really lost. They lost their purpose. And it's not just me saying it. There's ex-chief executives for housing providers from many years ago that will say the same now. The sector became lost. The social housing, especially social housing sector, became lost in their purpose. They moved away from being social housing providers, providing homes for some of the most vulnerable people in our country. And almost tenants would describe them as property developers. They became more obsessed with chasing this idea of, again, accumulating wealth, building as many homes to meet government targets to then generate as much funding and profit and surplus as possible, and completely forgot the fact that they've got many homes out there that people are living in and it's falling into disrepair. They forgot their main purpose was providing a service to social housing tenants. They forgot that it was social housing tenants actually funding these organisations through the use of rent, and forgot their contractual obligations towards those social housing tenants. But if the social housing tenants forgot their contractual obligations and stopped paying their rent, they'll receive a 30-day eviction notice. And I think those are the sorts of attitudes that we find ourselves in now. And it wasn't helped by the media. It wasn't helped by shows like Channel 4's Benefit Street. It wasn't helped by shows like How to Get a Council Home. again, Channel 4 show, it wasn't helped by these shows pushing this negative stigma of what a social housing tenant is. Because what we're learning now, and what I've learned over the last 3 years, it was completely false. All that was what I'd describe as poverty porn, where people sit at home on their sofas, get to watch the suffering of social housing tenants and get enjoyment, a bit of satisfaction, something to watch on TV out of the misery of the many people struggling to get a home up and down the country. Now what we're seeing is 139,000 homeless kids in England, their education being affected, their future prospects being affected as a result of that. We have high levels of rough sleeping. We have, well, it's predicted £2 billion is going to be spent on temporary accommodation because we simply do not have enough social homes currently. It's predicted that £2 billion will be spent this year. We've got the NHS spending £1.4 billion looking after people living in poor quality housing across the country, 34 million on those living in homes with damp and mould. That's the state of housing in this country now. And again, why it hasn't been seen as a priority at previous general elections, I don't know. Politicians view it, again, and that's the attitude towards housing in this country. Politicians view housing as something that isn't election winning. But when we look at housing, we have to understand that housing and having a roof over your head affects every single individual in this country. All 60-odd million people that live in this country affects. It doesn't matter if you're rough sleeping and sleep on the streets or you live in a mansion and your mortgage was affected last year or even this year because of inflation. It affects all of us and can affect all of us. And it's a human right fundamentally, and a human right that not everyone has access to. So it absolutely should be election winning. It should be, or be able to lead a manifesto, especially because we haven't had it prioritised since the Second World War. Whether that's going to happen this year, we're going to have to wait and see. But that's why we found ourselves in this situation that we find ourselves in now with housing.
And that has to be one of the most powerful synopsis of the housing condition I've ever heard. So
I know it's a bit long-winded.
It was absolutely spot on in terms of where we're at. And a couple of things really on that. I think absolutely, I've campaigned since 2013 on the failings of the right to buy policy and the replacement ratio, even in best case scenario, is 1 to 7. So those 2 million homes, and I'm no mathematician, so you work out what 1 in 7 of that is, and that's by far and away nowhere near enough. All of those things that you've said in terms of the perception, do you feel you've made a difference to that's now changing? Can you see light at the end of the tunnel with some of this?
I hope so. And I do think so, because that's what I set out to do. It really annoyed me in the very beginning, this perception of social housing tenants, this stigma that social housing tenants have been sort of tarnished with. Once upon a time, social housing, getting into social housing was a dream.
Yeah.
It was something everyone aspired to have.
It was.
It was something that people were proud of. It was something that we were providing our key workers with after the Second World War. It was absolutely something to be proud of. And one of the most proudest moments I think this country has seen is that investment into building social housing, just like it was when we developed the NHS. Yet that has changed over the last few decades. And I hope through my work and actually going out there and showing people, whether you live in social housing or not, this is how people are having to live. And it's through no fault of their own. And we've had situations like Albish. Like, remember how disgusted everyone was at Grenfell?
Yeah.
Remember how shocked everyone was? Remember how the sector said they were going to completely change things to make sure nothing like that would ever happen again? Remember how politicians lined the streets and promised that nothing like that would ever happen again, and that the families of Grenfell victims and survivors would get the justice they deserve? And nearly 7 years on, we are at a place now where we're learning that many, many thousands, if not millions, are living in disgusting conditions, slum conditions up and down the country. That, for me, again, reiterated that whole stigma and attitude towards social housing tenants and their lack of respect for them. But I'm hoping through my work and the work of others going out there and highlighting individual cases that people understand that those living in social housing is no different. We're all human beings at the end of the day. And people live in social housing, again, through no fault of their own. It could, for various different reasons, their family, their parents could have lived in social housing. Now they live in social housing. People from a variety of different backgrounds. I was talking to a solicitor only yesterday that lives in social housing. I've spoken to many solicitors that do, doctors, nurses, key workers, the people that keep this country going, the sort of backbone of our labour force in the UK. And a lot of them live in social housing. And I hope through my work I've been able to highlight that, and people realise, well, actually, these perceptions are quite ignorant that we have of social housing and the makeup of social housing tenants up and down the country. But it's something that's going to take not just the work of myself and other campaigners, but housing providers too, chief executives. It's going to take the government. It's going to take an overhaul in attitudes and behaviours towards and respect towards social housing tenants. It's going to take education, I think, internally within these organisations. And that, I think, is the biggest change we need to make. And it's the most immediate change that doesn't cost absolutely anything. It doesn't take funding to educate members of staff and those working within the sector and beyond about social housing, what its purpose was, who it is that lives in social housing, and the fact that fundamentally they're human beings at the end of the day. And if we wouldn't want to live in those conditions or be treated in that way, absolutely no one deserves to be treated in that way. I mean, it says more about us as human beings when there are animals in shelters like Battersea Dogs and Cats homes who have better living conditions than a lot of people in social housing. And I absolutely, first and foremost, let me just say, love animals. But I think that alone is absolutely disgraceful, that we can treat a certain class of people in this country less than animals because of where they're from, where it is that they live, and the stigma that comes along with who they are and the fact that they're in social housing.
Yeah, and I think in terms of, there's the old saying, isn't there, that you're only 3 paychecks away from being homeless. Homelessness is tenure blind. It's not about whether you live in a social rental property or if you own your own home. You are only those 3 paychecks away from being in one of the most stressful situations you can find yourself in. So absolutely get that. And I think the point that you made about culture, if anybody was in any doubt, hopefully after listening to this part of the podcast, then it will have helped enlighten them in terms of where the change still needs to be. I want to turn to, I suppose, to something where I do think there is some light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it's something that you probably need to give yourself quite a lot of credit for. I know you seem quite humble, so I'll give you the credit, whereas you probably won't. We've got some new consumer standards that are coming into effect from April this year, and I know that you have had a lot of influence around that, and certainly there's some of the private conversations that I have with some of the key decision makers. They've definitely been impacted by the passion and the lived experience that you've brought to that conversation. Now we know what the standards look like. I'm just interested in terms of whether you think they go far enough. Will they address some of the things that you've very eloquently summarised there in terms of where things are at? And if not, what else still needs to be added in there?
It's interesting. I think it's a great start. And I definitely think it's better than what we would have got under any other housing secretary, I have to say, and housing department. I think the Department for Levelling Up right now, under this Conservative government, is the right one to sort of facilitate the consumer standards. And they've gone a lot further than I would have expected under previous housing secretaries, and I'm not afraid to say that.
Can you name them all over the last 20 years?
Oh, no, I've lost count. I've lost count. There's probably...
I certainly couldn't, believe me.
There's been more, I'm sure, than... I don't know, how many have we had, actually? I've honestly lost count. I can't... It's been like a revolving door, but I think this last year, a year and a bit, has been unique. It's probably been the longest we've had one in a very, very long time. Does it go far enough? No. I'd like to see it go further. I think it's great, though, that we have tighter regulation. We need regulation. I don't think regulation's bad. I think under the coalition government, their removal of a lot of regulation and red tape, again, is contributed massively to where we found ourselves now. And there's a great book by Pete Apps, Show Me Your Bodies. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Show Me the Bodies, sorry.
Show Me the Bodies.
Show Me the Bodies, yeah. And it talks about the cutting to red tape and removal of regulation and the impact that has. And it's absolutely true. Absolutely true as to why we find ourselves in the situations we do now and why it is that so many tenants are living in the conditions that they live in now in unsafe homes. And again, that was a political decision that was made and it was absolutely the wrong one. But I definitely think this reintroduction of regulation is needed. Regulation isn't something that we should be scared of.
Yeah.
I think regulation provides safety. It provides clarity. It protects lives, ultimately, I think, to an extent. And I definitely think it's something that should have come a lot sooner after Grenfell. We should have realised at that point, no, something needs to be done as an emergency. And it took about, 5-6 years on after that before, or it's going to be 7 years actually, before it comes in. So I think it's a good start. Providers need to be kept on their toes. I think providers need to constantly be reminded of what their purpose is. They also need to be called out and reprimanded if they do decide to go off and do anything else. And then as a result, it's people's lives that are put at stake in their health and safety, or they need to be reminded that they are social housing providers, that they're to provide social housing. first and foremost, like any business, it should be the tenants that are their priority. I don't think any decision should be made without taking into consideration tenants. But I think many decision has been made over the last decade in regards to social housing without actually having conversations with social housing tenants.
Yeah.
And they either put up or shut up, or they jog on and go somewhere else. They should be lucky that they're in social housing, right? They're getting discounted rents. They're lucky there's 1.4 million people on the waiting list. If they're not happy, go somewhere else. And that's what's been the attitude for so long. But I hope with this change in regulation, it actually shows providers that, no, these are human beings at the end of the day. They need to be listened to. Ultimately, they're paying the wages of staff. They are paying you rent every month. They are keeping your business going. You're providing a service to them. You have to listen to them. I would say where I would have liked it to go a lot further is in those situations where people die as a result of what can only be described as corporate negligence. In the cases of Al-Bishak, and obviously we found out that there was traces of damp and mould in his lungs after he had passed away, and a direct result of the conditions that he was living in. We know what the attitudes were like. His parents were blamed. His parents had been complaining from before he was even born. They were told it was lifestyle. They were told it was due to ritual bathing. All of this discriminatory sort of rhetoric that was used by the people that they are paying rent to, ultimately. And I think in cases like that and Grenfell, there should be room and there should be scope for criminal prosecution when it results in the death of an individual in a social housing tenant. You look at any other sector and it would be the case. If it happened in a school, if it happened in the NHS, doctor or nurse, if they were treating their patients with the same sort of negligence that we're seeing within housing, they'll be struck off. Bare minimum. If someone was to die as a result of that, there could be criminal prosecutions. But for some reason, we do not have the same in social housing and public housing. I actually think it should be the same in private housing too. Yeah. Because ultimately, it's people's lives that you're dealing with.
Housing's housing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's housing's housing. So, yeah, and I think that's where it needs to go further, because that in itself will remind providers what your job is. Yeah. And what you need to make sure doesn't happen, and you make sure that you're doing what you need to protect lives, protect health and safety, and your tenants be the number one priority. It would almost be the biggest deterrent, I think, that you can have in place. But we don't have that, and I hope we do, because what I'd hate to see is another situation like Grenfell, where another 72 individuals lose their lives, or a 2-year-old doesn't make it to their 3rd birthday because they die through no fault of their own because of the conditions that they're living in. And we've had many a case since then where people have died. And I think ultimately that is going to be what it takes. But the consumer regulation that we've got now, or that we've got coming, is a step in that right direction, and a step towards actually remembering first and foremost that it's the consumer, it's the tenants, that you have an obligation and contractual duty to look after.
So let me ask you on that. Just interesting use of terminology there. So in terms of tenants and contractual arrangements, so one of the things that I know you mentioned before is the fact that you're not keen on the use of the term customer. It's something that we do use. And it was interesting then because you talked about the contractual relationships. I'm just interested in terms of, it's an age-old debate that's been around the housing sector as long as I have. Is the right terminology tenant, resident, customer, something else?
Well, for me, in terms of talk about contract, I do that because, I've studied business, and organisations and businesses are very quick to remind you, if you are a customer, of your contract or contractual duty. If you're in a job, you're constantly reminded by your employer what your contractual duty is. You can't just decide to take time off when you want or anything like that, or decide you're not coming in because you've got a contract. You're going to take 3 days off during the week, but you've got a 40-hour contract. And they're quick to remind you of what your contractual duties are. And I always mention that because I think it's important, just like a housing provider is quick to make sure a tenant, if they don't pay their rent, knows what their contractual duties are, we should be doing the same to our housing providers, because ultimately we've both signed a contract here and there are commitments on that in black and white of what you should and shouldn't be doing. And that's why I think it's important to mention that. In terms of the use of customer, I remember in the beginning, I always said it, I don't really like the term, especially when we're talking about social housing. It's a bit like we wouldn't use, when patients come into A&E, we don't refer to them as customers, we refer to them as patients, right? And I think in public and social housing, it should be the same with referring to them as residents and tenants, because I think the sector, again, has been using these business terms, which has made human beings seem like commodities, so like customers, and referring to their homes as assets or units as opposed to homes and places that they live, their residents and their tenants. It almost gives that sort of human aspect back to it, but also at the bare basics. If you are a customer, right, and you're receiving a good or a service, I've always said, if you're not happy with the service, if you're not happy with Netflix, or if you're not happy with a car that you bought, or it broke down after a month, you can go and return it or exchange it and get something else. Yeah. You can't do that in social housing. You've got a queue of 1.4 million people waiting behind you for a social housing property. You've got many hundreds of thousands in temporary accommodation waiting to get into social housing. If you're not happy with your home, you can't just exchange it. You can't pack your bags and say, right, I'm not happy with this. It's got damp and mold. It's got all of these issues. It's fallen to bits. I've been living here for 10 years. I'm packing my stuff. There's a house down the road. It's empty. I want to move there. Can you switch me? Because you're going to be told no is the answer to that. And I think that's why I prefer residents and tenants as opposed to customers, because they don't receive that same level of experience compared to a normal business and experience a normal customer would, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I absolutely get that. And I suppose certainly at Yorkshire Housing, we use the term customer, but it's interesting. It's more internal, more internally focused about the cultural shift. Because what strikes me is that not just at Yorkshire Housing, but across any organisation, many of the people who work in those organisations have a set series of expectations in their head when they're in their non-work life. But for some reason, when they're coming to work, a little switch goes in their head and they apply a completely different set of principles. So in some ways, the use of the term customer, certainly for us at Yorkshire Housing, is around just reminding people, actually, it's about providing a service. It's not just the bare minimum of what's in that contract and tenancy. There's no right or wrongs, which is why this debate's great, because it's been going around for an age, and it'll be going around long after you and I aren't in housing anymore as well. So
I'm sure.
It's just a really interesting one. I think one of the other things that's really interested me, and one of the phrases that's really stuck with me that I've heard you say on several occasions, is that there's no better experience than lived experience, and it's sort of cemented in me. It's like a brainworm now in here for me. How can landlords build that lived experience into their day-to-day operations and also their decision-making?
It's interesting, this whole term of lived experience. I think there's nothing better than lived experience. You can go and study for 3 years, a degree, and learn all the theory, but it's nothing compared to actually having lived experience. It's almost like driving a car. The theory is completely different to actually getting behind the seat of a car and actually driving it.
Yeah.
And I think providers have underestimated the power of lived experience from their tenants, and underestimated the influence and real change that the tenants, the people that are receiving their service, could have for that organisation in sort of guiding it to where it needs to be. And there's perhaps conversations that employees or social housing providers could never imagine having until they go out there and actually speak to those with that lived experience about issues that they're facing, what's going on behind closed doors, things that need to change, basic things that could happen.
Yeah.
I remember having a conversation, which I can probably say, I won't name the politician, but I was having a conversation with a politician and they said to me, so how can we fix this? What can we do? And I already came prepared, and I had about 15 points, which I slid over to them, and they had a look through it, and it's through lived experience that I came up, and it was completely different to what they could have imagined, and they turned around and said, right, a lot of these wouldn't even cost much. And I thought to myself, well, no, it wouldn't cost much. But I've been able to come up with that because I've got lived experience. There's this assumption that you need to throw money at the wall and hope something sticks, right? When in fact, what often happens with speaking to people with lived experience is a common sense approach to problems and problem solving. They're the ones facing the problems. They're the ones on the receiving end of the problems. Often they have to, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, think of a solution to that problem. And often they get frustrated because they're like, why aren't the providers doing this? Because they don't have conversations with them directly.
Yeah.
Whereas if that was the case, then there was more open dialogue and actually providers were allowing tenants to have that conversation, actually having conversations directly, whether you're a chief executive or not, with the people that you provide a service to, we may not be in the situation that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah.
So that's why I think lived experience is powerful, is the most powerful thing you can have. And that's why I think when it comes to decisions being made, one, whenever any decision is being made, we need to take into consideration the impact on tenants, but two, we should have tenants sat around that table when it comes to making those decisions too. I could apply the same to politics. Like, we're making political decisions in regards to the lives of many working class people, yet how many working class people have we got sat inside Westminster at the moment?
So your message is get out more, listen more?
Yeah, listen more. My message would be providers need to be more proactive rather than reactive.
Right.
They need to not wait for a situation like Grenfell or Albishak to happen. They should be getting out there. They should be going out, listening to the people that receive their service, trying to understand how they can improve, whether they think they're absolutely amazing. Doesn't matter what their KPIs are showing. That could show them 90%, but what's going on behind closed doors could be completely different. And that's what we've learned. Because we look at some of these housing associations that say they have 90% satisfaction survey. Then I come along and rock up with one of these news outlets and go into their homes, film, and put on national TV, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, actually, we've got these families living in slum conditions. So it's about being proactive, going out there, having those conversations, actually going for yourself and looking at the homes that people are living in and finding out how tenants are feeling, what it is that they need, what your priority should be. Should it be building homes and knocking up as many homes to meet targets as possible? Or should it be making sure you are looking after the health and safety first and foremost of the people living in your current homes at the moment?
Yeah, or balancing both.
Or balancing both.
Balance.
It's about
Everything in
priorities, I think.
moderation.
Yeah, it's about priorities and prioritising, and that's what it's going to take. Ultimately, though, what we need is funding. There needs to be a massive injection of funding into housing by government. They need to take it seriously. They need to realise that you're not fixing any other area of the country and the sort of issues that we're facing without first and foremost fixing housing. Look how much the NHS is spending on looking after people living in poor housing.
Yeah.
The impact on children's education, the 139,000 homeless kids, they're not going to be able to study. They're not going to be able to do their homework or get a good quality education. And what is that going to say? There's going to be a huge gap and skill shortage within our labour force. And it's going to be because of decisions being made by politicians at the moment not to prioritise the one fundamental, the very basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs, shelter for all of us.
Yeah.
Without shelter, you cannot progress, you cannot build up, you cannot focus on progressing or improving your lives if you don't have shelter. That's the very basic that we need as a human right. That's why we need to realise it's so important. If we don't get that right, we can't expect to make, as cliche as it is, make Britain as great as it could be.
Yeah. I mean, there's a long-standing link between housing and health.
Oh,
and health
absolutely.
Outcomes. But I think, the other thing that you brought into sharp focus, certainly during this podcast, and you mentioned it right at the beginning, was, how you and your sisters were studying in a home that where that was really difficult because of the condition. And again, it's then that impacts upon life chances going forward as well. So I know today we've focused on all the things that need to change, and we know there's a lot that needs to change. But we also know that it's not all bad across the housing sector. There are, a large number of homes that provide a safe, a secure, and affordable place for people to live and for them to call home. Could you just maybe share one or two positive things that you've seen emerge from your work, or some good examples of where you've seen things where you've been pleasantly surprised, perhaps?
Perhaps there's been some cases where after I've gone and highlighted the conditions that families are living in, those providers then did the right thing in regards to making sure they took the right steps to sort it to the end and make sure that they were happy. There's been many instances where that's not the case.
Right.
But there's been some instances where, yes, the tenants were struggling and that was the main thing, and that's absolutely shameful and inexcusable. But they did see that this is a problem. They cannot be living like this. We failed them. We need to figure out now how we fix this. And that's the approach that all providers need, because if they don't have that approach, you're in the wrong sector. Yeah. I think you should go and look for a job elsewhere. You shouldn't be working with people or in a job role where you are dictating the way in which people are going to live the rest of their lives ultimately. But there have been instances where that has happened. I also went to visit a housing association last year, I think it was, CHP. And I did a talk with them, and they mentioned a few things that were pretty positive about how they've refocused the way they do things and that making sure that tenants are the priority now. There was discussions about even merging, and that's a whole other thing that's a whole other conversation I could come on to. Because
we'll get you back for another podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
On that one.
But there was conversations happening internally about potentially doing that, and the chief executive turned around and said, no, we need to get the fundamentals right. And that's what I say time and time again. So there have been those positives, but in regards to my work, the only reason people come to me is because they're having absolutely horrific experiences. And yes, there may be positives, and that's great. I always say that there are far too many negatives. And just like in the NHS, right, doctors and nurses don't just start patting themselves on the back because they are doing the job that they should be doing. I think it should be the same for housing. What we need to get out of the sector is those failures and where people are suffering most, and make sure we are just doing the job that we are supposed to. Yeah. Within the sector, there's loads of these, annual award ceremonies and shows and celebrations, £3,000 for tables and whatnot, give each other awards. There's all of that bravado and whatnot, yet there are residents living in poor housing when in fact that needs to be the priority. That's what needs to be highlighted. That is what is shameful about the sector at the moment, and that is ultimately what needs to change. And then, if they want to give themselves as many awards as possible after that, once they fix that, absolutely give as many awards out as you want. But first and foremost, this is what needs to be addressed. This is what needs to be fixed. We cannot have people's lives being put at risk or people dying in their homes.
I look forward to the Kwajo Award whenever we come with that. So we've got a new feature for season 3, and I have to say, I am more than slightly nervous at this. It's called Flip the Mic. So we've introduced this to give all of our guests the opportunity to ask me some things that they may want to know. So with a great degree of worry, Kwajo, it's over to you.
Yes. So I've got a few questions. My first question would be in regards to your values and how you implement them throughout your organisation, all the work that you do and all the work that your staff does, as opposed to just having it in a bio on your website for people to read, like a lot of housing providers out there.
So we've got 5 values, and we launched them just before COVID struck. And what's been interesting is that they've really stood the test of time. The key ones for me in those, and get told off for highlighting 2 rather than 5, but the key ones for me are do the right thing, not the easy thing. And I think very often housing organisations and businesses are tempted to do the easy thing rather than what's right. And so for me, that's really key. I also think make it happen, because I think one of the problems in any large organisation like my own is that you can sometimes have a lack of ownership of issues. It's a bit like the hot potato that gets passed around. And for me, it's about just somebody take ownership of that and make it happen. Do what you say you're going to do. The absolute basics that you said before, the doctor and nurse equivalent of the housing sector. Just do what you say you're going to do and deliver it in a good way. But one of the other values is have fun, which you might sort of think that's a bit of a weird one, but my view of that and why that's so important is that if you are enjoying your time at work, if you are happy, you are delivering by default a better service. You've got a smile on your face when you're talking to customers or tenants and residents. We'll come back to that again, I'm sure, at some point. But for me, it's around actually, that's the key to providing a better customer service. So for me, I want people to wake up on a Monday morning and not think, oh, it's Monday, I've got to go to work. I want them to wake up on a Monday morning and think, great, what's this week got in store for me? What difference can I make? How can I actually improve the lives of the people that I come into contact with over the next 5 days? So for me, how we try and embed that is that we have a colleague recognition scheme, and it's not just where the nurse and doctor has done their day. These are people who've gone well over and above. And in Yorkshire, we do suffer from a bit of a cultural issue whereby we just take that as the norm. So people do extraordinary things very often, but they won't even mention it, and you have to drag it out of them. And so we try and recognise where people have really, really gone more than the extra mile. But also, I suppose, really importantly, our values. We don't recruit for skills, which might make you go, well, it's a bit weird. We recruit for values because our view is that we can pretty much train you up to do quite a lot of our roles. We can't change what goes on in your heart and in your head. And that's why we really push on the recruitment process. It's all about you as an individual and really what makes you tick and how you operate and how you think so that, we do get more of the right people in. Recruitment is an art, not a science, so I can't guarantee that we'll get it right every time. But I think it's about how do you embed those values in your business. So for me, that starts on the process in terms of when people want to come and join us and be part of our journey, right through the whole sort of way that we operate.
No, that's a very, very good answer, actually. This one's a bit, there's almost 3 elements to it. Right. So I've made it a bit more harder. The first thing would be, I wanted to ask, in regards to the next election, do you want to see more of a commitment to social housing as opposed to what we've seen at previous elections and building more quality social housing, investing in social housing? I also wanted to ask in relation to sort of attitudes towards housing. Do you think it needs to shift away from viewing housing as an asset and an opportunity to accumulate your wealth and realise actually it's a human right, it's a necessity that everyone needs? And also, how did Grenfell change your perspective on housing and residents? And did it switch? Was there a light bulb moment? Was there anything there that sort of changed within you?
Yeah. So let me go in reverse order.
Yeah.
Only because my memory is useless.
Yeah.
So Grenfell was a 9/11 moment for me. I think people say that there are certain points in their lives that are burnt into their memory banks that made them just literally take more than one sharp intake of breath and go, oh my goodness me, I cannot believe I am seeing this. And I remember waking up on the morning, I get up early, and one of the things I do is either look at my phone and it made me put the news on. And I was just horrified, if I'm being honest with you, about what I was seeing, as I'm sure everybody was who saw those pictures. But then when you understood what had led to Grenfell happening, that for me really, and I wasn't working at Yorkshire Housing at the time, I was somewhere else, but that really made me reevaluate the whole approach to health and safety and compliance issues, if you want to put the badge on it. But what it made for me is I stopped reading reports and taking people's external consultants coming in and telling you that everything was okay. I actually went and said, show me. Show me. Actually show me that's right. Show me that, show me the records, show me. And it was that whole mentality, I think, of moving away from it being almost like a tick box process to one where it was much more incisive around how we looked at and how we got assurance that what people said was being done was actually happening on the ground. I know you speak to many chief execs, and of course when you run a larger organisation, you can't possibly go and you have to. But I think what you can do is have a change in culture and also a change in the processes to ensure that your homes are safe and are secure, and that you've done all the things that you should do, whether that's testing fire alarms, sprinkler systems, fire doors, whether that's making sure that you've got a robust approach to getting into people's homes to service gas appliances each year, because I worked with carbon monoxide charity for several years, and again, some of the stories that they had of people who died absolutely needlessly from carbon monoxide, it's the invisible killer, right through to fixed wire testing and Legionella, and all those what are now the big seven. Now we've got damp mould and condensation. That's quite rightly we've added that to our what was big six. I think Grenfell was one of those moments where everybody just went, we need to look at assurance and how we know things are actually being delivered in the right way, in a different way to what was there before. Going backwards to your second point, in terms of assets, it's just bonkers, isn't it? No other country in the world, I think, operates in the way that the UK housing market does. You look at Europe, the average age of somebody who moves from renting, who may choose to buy but may not, is somewhere in their sort of mid-40s. So I think there's this whole perverse mentality that we've had around housing as an asset, and the fact that, we've got, for example, so many second homes. We've got so many issues in terms of where people have invested in housing and are then letting that housing out at inflated rents. And, my daughter lives in London, and, she has to bid against other people to share a flat with 4 others. And you look at this and you go, how have we managed to get to this position? So for me, I think it's coming. I think there's a generational shift. I've got 3 kids. And I see that their approach to how they view housing has shifted. I think they've looked around them and said, first of all, the current system is very unfair, very much weighted to people of my generation and my age. And secondly, they're looking at this and thinking, well, actually, I want more flexibility. The way the workplace works now, and particularly in terms of a much more agile way of working, people don't need to be in a particular local area. We employ people who live in London, we've got somebody who lives in Holland, we've got people in Scotland. We do draw the line at Lancashire, because we Yorkshire and Lancashire, we don't like that sort of that lot coming across. But I mean, joking aside, I think there's a generational shift and reset on some of this. And I think also, if you look at the reason why we've got such a lack of family homes, is that, we've not incentivised enough and helped people to release larger family accommodation. I'm not saying force them out, I'm saying incentivise them to say, actually, we understand it. That's been your home for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Whether you rent it or own it, it's a massive wrench to leave that home. And sometimes it's not financial incentives either. Sometimes it's just help me move. Give me that support and help me make that transition and make that move. So I think for me, there's a generational shift that's coming, and I think it's long overdue. Turning back to your first point on the general election, I think that, first of all, I think you have been particularly fantastic at raising the profile of housing. Not always the good stuff that's being done, but it's absolutely right that your campaign is absolutely shining a light in that area. But I think also, if I go back to, the very eloquent summary you gave of why we've got here and how we've got here, how can anybody in a decision-making role not listen back to that and say, if ever there's a business case, if you want to call it that, inverted commas, for more investment in housing in this country, then I'm not sure what else is going to convince them.
We're going to have to play this back to them. We're going to have to send it to them.
That was amazing, I'll tell you. So that was stunning.
So I wanted to ask, what's the biggest goal for Yorkshire housing over the next year or few years, especially with the introduction to all the new consumer regulation?
Yeah, so we really welcomed the introduction of consumer regulation. I think we had a long-standing view that the previous focus on just governance and financial viability was really missing the purpose of why we're here. So I think certainly from our point of view, we welcome consumer regulation coming in. It's challenging. It is challenging. I won't get away from that. And it's interesting because at a point in my housing career, about 2000 to 2005, so quite a number of years ago, I headed up the team that was the Ofsted equivalent for housing at the time, the Housing Inspectorate.
Yes.
That was really, really powerful in terms of changing mindsets and attitudes towards housing. That had a really strong focus on tenants and residents and how they were involved in decision making. So all the things you've been talking about, we've been here before. What we don't need to do is to repeat the mistakes that we made before. And the two key mistakes there were that, first of all, it was very prescriptive. So we had things called key lines of inquiry. So for each part of a housing service, the Audit Commission set out what a good service should look like. And the problem with that is that a good service, say, for example, in an inner city environment, might be different to what a customer in a rural setting or a coastal setting would want. And also, it didn't necessarily fully differentiate for the very diverse communities that we work in. So in some ways, that prescription led to a bit of a vanilla housing service offer. And the second element where it fell over was that at that time, we inspected every local authority service and every housing association service. For local authorities, the outcome of the inspection triggered whether or not they were able to access additional funding to invest in their existing housing stock. So if you were a poor housing provider delivering poor quality services, you didn't get additional funding until you raised the quality of those services. But actually, in some cases, the tenants and residents living in those homes were living in those homes for another 2, 3, 4 years until the housing provider got its act together before additional investment came in to provide new kitchens, new bathrooms, all the things that, many of those homes hadn't had any replacement since the 1950s, 1960s in terms of when they were originally built. So in terms of our preparation for that, I think we're looking at how we can ensure that we really hear the voice of the customer. We've done a whole raft of things around this, and I know two of our customers who are really sort of great champions of ours and really provide us with some really useful feedback. Have been on recent webinars that you've run. But I think, for me, it's about how we actually use that as part of decision making. So we've done, for example, for our board, who make the big decisions in our organisation, we did a year in the life of. So completely unfiltered. We followed the lives of 8 of our customers across Yorkshire Housing, and they just did video diaries, and we played them before every board meeting. And there was no filtering of it. So they literally said, this has happened since the last time I've recorded something. You did this and it didn't work out, and I'm really not happy. And it was a really, really powerful way that our board were able to get in their minds at the start of the meeting. Actually, this is about customers. This is about making decisions and making sure that we don't make a decision which compounds some of the issues that are being flagged to us. They also highlight some of the things that work well. So again, it was enabling them to sort of see that. But for me, I think it's not about standards. For me, standards are a basic. They're an absolute, they're the minimum. For me, it's about how do you make people feel? It's not about whether you do things, whether you do a repair, whether you sort antisocial behaviour, whether you help somebody move. It's about how you've made them feel as part of that process. So the consumer standards are a great, starting point, and at least it provides a safety net, if you want to call it that. But my ambition and my colleagues' ambition at Yorkshire Housing is to go well above that. We don't always get it right, and I think the other thing that we really need to ensure that we have a continued focus on is what organisations do to put things right when they do go wrong.
That was all of the questions I had.
Oh, I could sit back and relax again, Kwajo. Thank you. So to wrap things up, we have the quick fire round. So literally sort of no more than sort of 20 seconds. First one, what's your key takeaway for anyone working in social housing?
Tenants. They have to be the priority.
Great. I'm going to use that as a strapline. Second one, if you were housing minister for a day, and let's face it, some of them have only lasted a day, what would you change?
What would I change? Well, first and foremost, there would be more investment in social housing. That would become the priority, I think, of myself as housing minister. And then I'll focus on all the other areas like rented accommodation. Then we can focus on home ownership when we provide people with the opportunity to even save to get onto the property ladder.
Excellent. Final one for me. What does the future hold for Kwajo?
Oh, well, this year I'm going to continue campaigning up until after the election and then see if things really does improve. Who knows, I might not ever stop campaigning in regards to housing. Whether I go into politics next, I don't know. Whether I go into something completely different, I honestly don't know.
Kwajo for PM?
Oh, Kwajo, no, not right now, because I'm trying to make it to 30. I'm like, I need a holiday, that's what I need. But who knows, I might go into politics. If I don't, I might just wander off and go and do something else in the background and, just try and enjoy myself for a bit.
Good stuff. Well, I'm afraid to say it's time to close the door on this episode of the podcast. I want to say a huge thank you to you, Kwajo, for sharing your story and your insights, some incredibly powerful messages in there. And also it's given, I hope, our listeners a huge amount to think about from what we've heard. So just one final ask from me. I hope you will join me for another episode of Raising the Roof. To do that, you need to hit subscribe button from wherever you get your podcasts. But that's it. It's a wrap. Thanks for listening.